Hi there, friends. I'm Lisa Rana, and welcome to another Assemble This video. I am all about the watercolor today, and I'm sharing this pair of adorable winter birdie cards. We'll be creating a fun and easy watercolor background, and I'll walk you through my watercolor process as well. Lots of tips and techniques to share with you today that you can apply to your winter cards and any cards that you do all year round. I'm featuring the Winter Birdie Swag stamp set from Unity Stamp Company. This little guy is all about staying warm and cozy in his winter swag, and I couldn't wait to stamp him out. I've gathered my main supplies to get us started. So first up, let's work on that fun winter background, which combines two main techniques: heat emboss resist and ink smooshing. I'm using some watercolor paper and stamping with VersaFine Clear ink in Morning Mist. Since we'll be using lots of water, you'll want a nice watercolor paper, somewhere in the 140-pound range. I grabbed a few leaves from the Embrace the Change stamp set. This stamp set has a great mix of outline leaves and some solid image leaves as well, and I like to mix that up. I'm focusing my stamping around the edge of the paper, mainly because my image is going to be in the center or maybe bottom third of the card. I'm not really sure yet, but I'm keeping the center kind of open because it's going to be covered up later anyway. I like to start out with the larger image stamps and then work my way down to the smaller ones so they can fill in the gaps. Once I had all my outline leaves stamped, I came in with the solid ones. And I really love the contrast of the solid over the outline. Once we emboss this and build up our background, you're really going to notice the difference between the two different styles of the stamps. I chose to use VersaFine Clear because I wanted the color, and then also it stays wet long enough for embossing. But if you don't have VersaFine Clear, you can absolutely use Versamark or any type of embossing ink instead. Now I'm just going to pour on my embossing powder and then heat that with my heat tool. And I really like the color behind the white embossing powder. It just creates this really neat shadow. Now I'm going to be adding ink over the top of this, but it's still a neat effect that I'm going to remember for the future. So now that we have our background stamped, we are going to prep for ink smooshing. And I have a mixed media mat. This is just a silicone sheet. You could use anything that's kind of slippery that the ink will kind of slide on. And I'm smooshing down my colors. I'm using broken china and frayed burlap. And then I'm adding some water. And then I'm just going to smush my panel into that ink. Use my fingers to kind of push around that water and ink underneath, and then I lift it up and take a look. It's always fun to kind of push that paper around, let the water kind of run up and down, tap it in back into that ink, and just kind of create a messy look. Next, I'm just going to set that aside. You could let it dry completely on its own, but I'm in a hurry, so I grab my heat tool. Just be careful that you don't reheat that embossing powder too much. Next, I'm going to come in with a little bit more control and use my paintbrush and dab on some ink into my background. I love the way that this broken china and frayed burlap kind of mix together into this pretty green color. So I'm using that to really focus on the leaves and then just kind of tap into certain areas on the background. I also used it to splatter onto my background after I let it dry completely. And here is that background. Now do make sure that you let it dry completely, so I set it aside and let it do its thing. Next up, let's watercolor this adorable little bird. I have him stamped out on the same watercolor paper using some more VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. It's just a water-friendly ink. I know that it's not going to react with the water. And then I have a list of distress inks that I'm going to be using. That's festive berries, broken china, frayed burlap, pumice stone, and walnut stain. And I have them laid out on my mat, and then I just added a little bit of water to the center of each one. So this is my working palette. You could, of course, use any type of watercolor medium. This is just what I chose to work with today. I do tend to watercolor with distress inks a lot. I just really like the vibrancy of the colors, and they're just really easy to use for lots of techniques. So I'm starting out with a tiny brush, and I did the branch of the bird. I dried that completely because anytime you add water, it's going to pull ink into that area. So I don't want it to pull that brown into my blue background. So I dried that, and then I'm moving on to mixing a little bit of that broken china with the frayed burlap, kind of pulling in that green color that I got from the ink smooshed background. I just really like that surprised ink combo. And I'm using a thicker brush that's nice and soft, and then I'm just creating my border and then tapping on another layer of color right on top of that. Again, I dried it completely because I don't want the red of the berries to bleed into that background. Watercolor loves water. And it's a fun technique that you can play with, but when you don't want things to bleed, then you want to make sure that it's dried completely. Next, moving on to the body of the bird, I'm using some pumice stone, and I'm just tapping that on lightly. I like the texture of tapping on watercolor. It creates a different variance in the depth of color on its own as it dries. So I'm starting out with the pumice stone, and then I'm just adding some tapped on accents of that walnut stain. Just like the combo of this warm birdie, even though it's a cool scene. I like the warm colors that I'm using. Now you can take away a little bit of color if you add some water. You can kind of lift it up with your brush, or kind of move out that color and soften the edges. So that's what I'm doing right now. I do have a cup of water up to the side of my mat that I'm using, as well as a baby wipe that I'm using to clean my brush off in between layers and colors. Now I'm just going to tap on some color into that hat. I'm using a mix of the water of the ink versus the straight ink from the mat, and that's going to create your vibrancy and intensity of color. And what's fun, again, you can dry in between layers and then layer on top to create even more dimension. Sometimes I'm just feeling lazy and I don't want to go through the drying process, but I do have my heat tool to the side so I can grab it and dry a layer really quickly, and then I can layer on some more color. And now I'm just kind of adding all my details. And then once I'm happy, I dried it completely with my heat tool, grabbed a white paint pen, and I'm just adding some highlights and little white details. I just think it adds another level of depth and interest to your cards. For this birdie, I just did some highlights on his body and his clothes and that branch. For the other card, I did add some dots of snow in the background as well. So here are our two cards. I just really love the effect of that heat embossing and ink smooshing together of the watercolor look. That background just turned out really textured and fabulous. And then I just threw that on a craft card base, matted up the bird, and then added a few clear droplets for an accent. For the second card, I kept it more simple and just layered up some scallops and rectangles. And then I added a few of those clear dewdrops as well. And then you can kind of see the hint of the snow from the white gel pen. As always, I'll have all the supplies linked in the description of this video and on my Dollhouse Designs YouTube channel and blog. I'd love it if you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Plus, if you have any questions or sweet comment, post below. Thank you again for creating with me. I really hope you were inspired, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye.